I want to preach a message this morning with this title, and that is the nuclear family. The nuclear family, that term has been around for quite some time, but it's relatively new to me. I guess I hadn't paid attention to that little phrase until just the last 2 or 3 years of my life. I didn't fully understand the term nuclear family, even though I've heard it on and off the last 2 or 3 years. Even this week, in preparation for this message, I decided to look up the definition and kind of the etymology of this little phrase. So maybe you, like me, are not as familiar with the definition of the idea of a nuclear family. It is something we're hearing thrown around a lot in our culture, so it'd be advantageous for us to understand what it means. And to give you a negative explanation first, it would be then to say that the nuclear family has nothing to do with nuclear bombs or chemical warfare. But rather, on the positive side, it does, though, refer to the core members of a family. The idea of nuclear as in nucleus or as in kernel. The idea of nucleus is that which is essential. Okay? So when I talk about the nuclear family, I'm talking about that which is essential to the development of a healthy culture and a healthy society. In specific, the nuclear family includes a husband and a wife, and that husband and wife have children and become a father and mother, and they together are raising their biological children. This is a nuclear family. And a message this morning on the family is extremely relevant, especially as we observe the many attacks on the family all around us in our culture. The family is the chief institution of a healthy society. You may recollect in recent Sunday morning services, I have talked a lot about our culture. And in both of the last 2 Sunday morning sermons, I alluded to what I have called homework. And that was specifically that if you're interested in understanding what God wants us to do, how God wants us to conduct ourselves in an ever-increasing carnal culture, I have said your homework is to study Ephesians 5 and 6. 2 of the most important chapters in the Bible about how to conduct yourself in the midst of a wicked and decaying culture are these chapters, Ephesians 5 and 6. And in the midst of these chapters, there's an explanation on conduct in the home. Why is that there? Because strong families can help build back or repair a crumbling culture. The Spirit of God moves the Apostle Paul to pen these inspired words in the midst of a messy carnal culture known as Ephesus. The nuclear or traditional or biblical family is something that is essential. Again, I gave you the definition. The nucleus of a potentially healthy culture. It's represented in this entity, this institution known as the family. And I do have to publicly recognize a few things here before I get into the main meat of the message in relationship to preaching on the family. Before I get into all of that, I recognize that God has called some people to singleness. You have no ambition to get married, you are not married, you don't have any children, and you know that God has called you to singleness. Certainly there are benefits to singleness, and maybe you are, as a single person, very aware of those benefits. My wife often tells me that she thinks there are benefits to singleness. It's kind of an awkward thing to tell your husband. It's usually when she wants the remote, okay? She wants the cat to sleep in our bed. That has been prohibited in our almost 25 years of marriage, okay? And so it's then when she brings up the benefits of singleness. And so some of you, God has called you to singleness, and you understand that. And yet, the human penman of the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul, he also was called to singleness. And all along the way, Paul, though, is cheering for the success of what I want to call the nuclear family. as a single individual. He understood the importance of this idea, this nuclear family, and its impact on a culture. And so as a single man, cheering and instructing in relationship to the success of husbands and wives, as the success of fathers and mothers with their children. And I also want to recognize not only singleness, but that there are among us very likely single parents. And so I want to publicly say that I know that being a single parent includes unique struggles. It is a difficult situation. For whatever reason, your children's other parent is no longer in the picture. And so you're trying to do the best you can to navigate your difficult situation. And your family situation is not God's ideal. And so you've been just trying to pick up the pieces and do the best that you can do to personally pursue righteousness with the situation of your life. I want you to know that if you are a single parent and you are trying to pursue righteousness and pick up the pieces, I want you to know that I respect you tremendously. Again, to the extent that you're pursuing righteousness and doing the best that you can. But you too, even as a single parent, you should be cheering on the success of the nuclear family in our ever-decaying culture. Because after all, you know how difficult it is to be the one person trying to do the job of two people. You don't wish your struggle on others. No, you want others to avoid those struggles. So you're cheering for the success of their marriage and cheering for their parental success. Even personally, I grew up in a situation that wasn't God's ideal. And I did, relatively speaking, turn out okay, I think. But I wouldn't want my situation for my children. I want something better for them. I want God's ideal for them as much as they can pursue those things. And then also I want to recognize that there are among us, very likely, married couples who don't have children. And the two of you are a family. And yet you are also wisely cheering on the success of the nuclear family. And so as we think about this topic, I want us to consider these three ideas. First of all, this morning we'll consider the author of a biblical family or a nuclear family. Secondly, we will consider the many attacks directed at the nuclear family. And then thirdly, we will get to the advantages of raising a family God's way. All right, so that's what is before us this morning. First of all, consider with me the author of the nuclear family. Who's the originator? Who is the author of this idea of husband and wife becoming father and mother and raising their children? Whose idea is that? It's God's idea. And the text presents that to us in many different ways in Ephesians 5 and 6, but one of those ways is in the little phrase at the end of verse number 2, the first commandment with promise. The idea of commandment, you understand, is a reference to the 10 commandments. The human penman, again, is Paul, and he is referencing, very likely, Exodus 20. He is he's quoting one of the 10 commandments in verse number 2, which is to honor thy father and mother. So he's bringing up the fifth commandment listed in Exodus 20, honoring your father and mother. This is the first commandment. And if you read through the list of 10 commandments, you will notice that there are several commandments that have to do with family. In addition to honor thy father and mother, there is also thou shalt not commit adultery. Fidelity in marriage is important in cultivating a strong nuclear family. And so thou shalt not commit adultery. The 10th commandment is thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Not only should you avoid the actual act of adultery, but you should avoid coveting your neighbor's wife. It starts in your heart. So a prohibition. These are God's commands in relationship to the family. God's the author of a traditional or biblical family. It was God in Genesis 1:27 who created male and female. I never knew that would be so controversial. But God's the one who created mankind. It was God in Genesis 2:24 who said a man should leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. So not only is God the author of mankind, but He's also the creator of marriage. The two shall be one flesh. And further, it was God who said, be fruitful and multiply. So God creates mankind, and God created marriage, and God encourages multiplication, you might say. God is the author, and as author, He has authority to set the structure of a family. It's the author who says, listed in Ephesians 5, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. As the author, He sets the ground rules. It's the author who says to the family, and specifically to the husband, husband, love your wife. Love your wives. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave Himself for it. It's the author who says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. God designed the family, and God has the right then to direct the family in these ways and several other ways. In a biblical family, the man is to be the head of the home. If you were to refer to that, if you're the man, if you were to refer to that in front of your wife, that ought not be news to your wife. The man is to be the head of the home. He is to lovingly and wisely and biblically lead his family. And the wife, she is to reverently and willingly and intentionally follow his leadership. And then together as a team, they are to bring up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And all along the way, they're to do that with the commitment till death do us part. There's such security in that. When children that you're raising understand that you really meant your wedding vows. I mean, those children look to mom and dad, and they are in those formative years figuring out how they're going to conduct themselves later on in their lives. So all along the way, it's husband and wife before it's father and mother. And those vows, when you said them, when you were pronounced husband and wife, they mean something. And you're keeping those vows that you made before God and before that gathering of people. This is the author's plan for the nuclear family. However, secondly, this morning, there certainly is an attack on a biblical, traditional family. And there are many types of attacks, and yet all of the attacks that are out there, and I will go into specifics on just a few, but all of the many attacks on the family that are out there can be put in one of three categories. It's either an attack from the world, or the flesh, or the devil. When I say the world, and if you're tracking with some of these subpoints, I'll use those three ideas as some subpoints for you. But when I say this letter A then would be the world, I'm talking then about the ideologies of a carnal culture. The world. It's their agenda. It's their influence. It's their ideologies. Our culture wants to destroy and deconstruct God's design for the family. I just spent some time explaining how the author constructed and designed the family. God did that. Now we're talking about how the culture is trying to undermine all of that. How does the culture, how does the world do that? Well, it's our culture that says that homosexual couples should go ahead and raise children. What a mess. Even nature tells us that won't work. But the culture says, oh yeah, it's fine, go ahead. We need to accept the fact that it takes two people to raise children, and that specifically it takes a father and a mother. Like those children need to observe both roles, and two people of the same gender cannot adequately raise a child. Whether you have a son or you have a daughter, your son needs a mother and a father, and your daughter also needs a mother and a father. Both parents play an important role in the lives of their children. I mean, after all, Ephesians talks about the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Typically, fathers are the ones that are the disciplinarians in the home. Fathers are typically the tough ones in the home. He might be the one that is doing more of the admonition. And typically, the mother is given towards that nurturing kind of a spirit. I mean, there's a balance at play there, and I know there's overlap in those two things. Certainly a father will hug and nurture his child, but often, again, he is the more strict, and he is the, hey, stop it. She told you to stop it. You didn't stop it. I'm going to make sure you stop it. I mean, don't cross that line, because, by the way, when the father enters the home, there should be a different tone, a different spirit. There's nurturing coming from him at times, but there's also, okay, Father's home. We've been conducting ourselves reasonably while Mother was home, but we're going to take it up a notch because Father is home. I mean, there's an element there of importance in relationship to sufficiently raising your children. You're going to need both father and mother. The toughness of a father is perfectly counterbalanced with the warmth of a mother. And again, these ideas are given to us here in Ephesians 6 with nurture and admonition. I know that my kids need me. And I also know that they need their mother. And for one of us to not be in the picture would be a terrible disservice to my children. And there have been many times my wife has said to me, especially in recent days, she says stuff to me like, thank you for being our children's dad. I've said similar things to her. She brings certain things to the table as it pertains to parenting that I just can't and that I don't, and vice versa. And especially as children get older, there are things that only their father can really help them effectively navigate. I know they need me, and I know they need her. And to do it any other way is to put unnecessary struggle on those children. And yet the culture champions the nonsense of a homosexual couple raising children. Not only that, but the culture champions the feminist movement. Many females don't want to play their role, and so they're sinfully discontented in the role that God has called them to play. And so they cry out for women's empowerment. I did some research this week on the feminist movement, and I discovered a name that I wasn't familiar with until this week, and I've read extensively, and I'll only give you just a small portion of what I have discovered about this individual. But Kate Millett is an American feminist of a previous couple generations. She is the author of a book. The book is entitled Sexual Politics. She attended Oxford University and did some postgraduate work in another Ivy League school. But Kate Millett is the founder of the National Organization for Women. And her book, Sexual Politics, was called by the New York Times, it was called the Bible of Women's Liberation. And one of the things that this Ivy League trained individual was a part of, as the founder of this National Organization for Women, it started with just 12 females. And she would gather those other ladies. One of them was her sister Mallory, who since left the feminist movement and has written extensively on the evils of the feminist movement. But one of the things these 12 women would do in the very beginning of this organization is, as they opened their meetings together, they would do some kind of a Q&A or a catechism where there's questions and answers, and it was a chant. And Kate would start the meeting with a question, and the question first was, why are we here today? And the other 11 women would respond in unison, to make revolution. And then Kate would say, what kind of revolution? And they would respond, a cultural revolution. And then Kate would say, how do we make a cultural revolution? And they would respond by saying, by destroying the family. And then she would say, how do we destroy the family? And then they would respond by saying, by destroying the American patriarch. And then, how do we destroy the American patriarch? They would say, by taking away his power. And then she would say, how do we do that? And they would say, by destroying monogamy. And then her last question, well, how do we destroy monogamy? And then they would all respond by promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, and homosexuality. By the way, all of that has come to fruition in the culture in which we live. And also, by the way, what a weird way to start a meeting. But boy, they were purpose-driven. I mean, a specific strategy. The specific strategy of the feminist movement. And it seemingly has all worked. The world is against the nuclear family. Another way that the world is attacking a traditional or biblical family is the culture tells you not to discipline your children. Amen. Yet God tells you over and over and over again in Scripture, you need to discipline your child. If you teach your child to obey, you have taught them something absolutely tremendous. Don't teach your children to obey for your sake, as if you're some autocrat or some dictator or you're full of pride and they better listen to you. After all, I am the father. I have this position of authority. They better listen to me. No, that's not why you teach them to obey. You teach them to obey because when teaching a child to obey, you're also teaching a child how to focus. Focus. Come here. I said, come here. They listen to the voice of their father. They obey the voice of their father. They're attentive to the voice of their father. You know, if you tell your child to come here and your child turns and runs, or you tell your child stop talking and your child continues to, you have a disobedient child. Clearly your child is disobeying you, but that child will, in other areas of their life, struggle with focus. I mean, you do your child a wonderful thing when they're little if you teach them to obey, because later on in life, they're going to be far better students when their teacher says, look at this, or read this book, or do this homework. You've taught them to focus, not just on the whims, the fleeting cravings of their heart. But no, hey, look, do, go, sit, whatever the instruction is. It's a powerful thing. The culture says, don't you spank your children or we'll call CPS on you. You know, loving discipline is a gift to a child. So be faithful to that. But the culture's attacking biblical parenting in so many ways. Not just the world, but also an attack on a family is our flesh. And you see on the screen there is Ephesians 6:4, where the Bible says, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. And sometimes fathers, or even really the idea is parents in the text, fathers or mothers provoke their children to wrath because the parents aren't serious about parenting. Instead, the parents are constantly giving in to their flesh. And then the children see the anger issues that maybe the father has, and the children go wayward. I mean, they're mad at their parents. They've been provoked to wrath because of maybe sinful duplicity in the parent's life. And the enemy, we didn't listen to the world's ideologies or the culture. No. You just listened to the carnal cravings of your own fleshly heart. And so many men are AWOL. I mean, they're away without leave because they've given into the things that the feminist movement was promoting. These men have given into their flesh. The feminists and all their worldly agenda maybe lured or enticed these men to give into their flesh. And so they're away without leave. They're into promiscuity and eroticism and prostitution. And maybe some of them even have got into homosexuality. And maybe mama is doing the best she can now to raise those children because daddy gave in to his flesh. When infidelity becomes prevalent, and it is prevalent in our culture, then single parenthood becomes the norm, and increasingly it is becoming the norm. And when single parenthood becomes the norm, a culture is heading for destruction. So maybe it's not the man who gives into his flesh, maybe it's the woman. She gives into her flesh. She indulges in maybe the lies of the feminist movement and is sick of God's plan in relationship to her husband and God's responsibility laid at her feet in relationship to her kids. She's sick of all that, and she wants she wants this woman's empowerment. And maybe she wants the sexual freedom that she thinks men have, and so they're advocates often for aborting babies. And maybe the mom, the female in the relationship, she rejects the protection and provision of a loving husband, and she wants to follow her flesh into fierce individualism. It's the flesh. It's warring against the soul. And you know who suffers from it? The children suffer from it. So the enemies, the attacks, the world, the flesh, and of course, the devil. The devil's behind it all. He loves the agenda of an increasingly carnal culture. And he loves our fleshly propensities, and he often tries to highlight them and entice us through them. He is behind it all. He was there in the garden, enticing a married couple in Genesis 3 to disobey God's instruction. The devil delighted that Cain killed Abel and that he was able to at least get one of those children. The devil wants to destroy the nuclear family. That's why Ephesians 6 tells us to put on the whole armor of God, that we may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. So God is the author of a biblical family, and the attacks on the nuclear family are many. But then thirdly this morning, consider with me the advantages to doing family God's way. And I want us to see the little phrase there in verse number 3. The phrase is that it may be well with thee. That it may be well with thee. If you do family God's way, it will be well with you. There are advantages to be enjoyed. And I know that phrase is in the context of honor. You know, the context of children being instructed to honor their father and mother. And yet it has a larger application than just that, because you understand that you teach your children what it means to honor. Like, it is our responsibility to be honorable. If you are honorable yourself, you will incentivize the opportunity for your children to honor you. So you are not unrighteously angry. You're not known in your children's mind for adultery. Hopefully you're not known in your children's mind as an arrogant individual. No, you're conducting yourself honorably. You're conducting yourself faithfully, respectably, with a spirit of temperance. Those are things that your children can see in you and then appreciate about you. But if you're constantly giving in to the agenda, the attacks of the world, it's very unlikely that they're going to honor you. Sometimes fathers say, I don't know why my children disrespect me. I don't know why my kids have no honor for me. Oh, my kids really should honor me. Doesn't the Bible say that? Pastor, would you go ahead and preach on that for a little while? Tell those kids they need to honor me. Well, sure, they should, but you make it so much easier for them if you stop yelling unrighteously at your wife, at their mom. I mean, I'll never forget the times that I saw my stepdad hit my mom, strike my mom, fight with my mom. I watched my mom retaliate with my stepdad, throwing dishes, and just all this unrighteous anger in our home, drama-filled. I mean, some of that stuff is forever etched in my brain, and many of you probably grew up in broken homes as well, and you won't forget the violent aspects of that home. And it started with some conflict or some bit of a combative nature, and it accelerated into violence and craziness. And it's heartbreaking. I'm saying you avoid unrighteous anger, and you avoid adultery. You avoid being arrogant. Instead, you be honorable, and then they will honor you, and all of it it will be well with you. Do it God's way. There's no better way. It's an advantage. Love your spouse for God's sake. And love your spouse for your spouse's sake. But love your spouse also for your children's sake. I mean, my wife and I, going on 25 years of marriage, there have been times, and if you've been married a significant duration, you've had times of conflict in your marriage where you were feuding one with another. We've had those times. And we got married so young, we were 18 and 19 years old. And so we grew up together. And we could both quote verses. She could quote, "Wives, submit yourself to your husbands." And I could quote, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved." But we didn't know how to do it. So we had times of conflict, serious conflict. And in those times of conflict, the Lord had entrusted children to our care. And there were points where we had discussions like, yeah, we know we're going to try to work through this and we've got to figure this stuff out. But if we can't find love for each other right now in the midst of this conflict, let's find some love for each other for their sake. Because there's more to it than just us. I mean, for God's sake, in front of a couple hundred people, we said, "I do." For God's sake, we want to keep those commitments. And for one another's sake, hopefully after you've had conflict, you can fall back in love and you can heal and forgive sometimes the transgressions that occur in a marriage. But do it for their sake, because they're looking at you and they're watching you and they're learning. And you've been trying to teach them focus, and maybe they haven't obeyed and focused well, but for whatever reason, they're definitely focused on that. They're retaining it, they're seeing it, they're being influenced by it. Love your spouse for your children's sake. And if you do, they'll have many advantages. If you navigate the rough times in marriage, you will then give a strong support system to your children. If they know mommy and daddy aren't perfect, I mean, after all, mommy married a sinner and daddy married a sinner, and so they know their parents aren't perfect. But if they have a sense that, okay, they're going to have some conflict, my parents will once in a while, but they're going to love the Lord and they're going to love each other and they love us and they're going to work through these things, then the advantage for the children is that strong support system, that developmentally strong support system in the areas of emotion. I mean, if they see you governing your emotions reasonably well, they're going to have then the ability to do the same. Emotionally, academically. If you work through your conflict in marriage, your children are going to be able to work through things intellectually, mentally, socially. If parents are what God wants them to be, it's very likely that you will have socially well-adjusted children. And even spiritually, and even financially. A two-parent home, two parents committed to raising those children are going to do reasonably well in most scenarios, even financially. These are advantages. Do it God's way, and it will be well with you. So by way of conclusion, I want to encourage you parents, you that have been entrusted with a family as I've previously described, I want to encourage you to stay committed to God's design for the family, no matter what the world says. Stay committed to it. And stay physically committed to each other. Your marriage, I heard somebody say this, I thought it was true and good, at least in one way it's true and good. Your marriage is for your children, if for no other reason. Your vows matter. Even though you're tempted towards promiscuity like other couples, even though you are annoyed with one another in your marriage occasionally, even though there is sometimes conflict in your marriage, again, because you married a sinner, you work through all of that because those kids need both a father and a mother. And some of you are in the category of extended family. I mean, you're the grandparents. Britton and I are soon to be empty nesters, and so we're going to be in that category of extended family, and we are excited about those days. We've talked a lot about what it'll be like to be grandparents, and eager for those days to come, but not too eager. Okay, but eager all at the same time. And I'm saying if you're in that extended family category, you probably sat here thinking that you didn't need this message, and I hope not. Because in reality, you need this message too. I mean, these are things that you need to counsel your children and grandchildren about. And what I just endeavored to preach from this text are ways that you need to pray for these upcoming generations of people that are dealing with the allurements of this culture and their flesh and enticements of the devil. We all need this to one degree or another. No matter what your family situation is, and I said a lot about that in the introduction, or no matter what your age and stage of life is, we all need these things because our culture is against God's plan in every way. And together as a church, we need to advocate for these things because these are the things the Lord has said should be so. Would you stand, please, with me?